Mr. Bookman here. Before I go ahead and start today's audiobook, do me one small favor. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And if you like today's book, make sure you do give it a thumbs up. Also, check out the comments for discussions. But more importantly, make sure you look in the description. You're going to see a link in there that's going to give you access to over 200 ebooks. Now let's dive right into today's book.
Section 9. Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 2, The Lost Arctic Voyagers, Part 1, from Household Words. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Martin. The Lost Arctic Voyagers. Dr. Ray may be considered to have established, by the mute but solemn testimony of the relics he has brought home, that Sir John Franklin and his party are no more. But there is one passage in his melancholy report, some examination into the probabilities and improbabilities of which we hope will tend to the consolation of those who take the nearest and dearest interest in the fate of that unfortunate expedition, by leading to the conclusion that there is no reason whatever to believe that any of its members prolonged their existence by the dreadful expedient of eating the bodies of their dead companions. Quite apart from the very loose and unreliable nature of the Eskimo representations, on which it would be necessary to receive with great caution even the commonest and most natural occurrence, we believe we shall show that close analogy and the mass of experience are decidedly against the reception of any such statement, and that it is in the highest degree improbable that such men as the officers and crews of the two lost ships would or could, in any extremity of hunger, alleviate the pains of starvation by this horrible means. Before proceeding to the discussion, we will premise that we find no fault with Dr. Ray, and that we thoroughly acquit him of any trace of blame. He has himself openly explained that his duty demanded that he should make a faithful report to the Hudson's Bay Company or the Admiralty of every circumstance stated to him, that he did so as he was bound to do without any reservation, and that his report was made public by the Admiralty, not by him. It is quite clear that if it were an ill-considered proceeding to disseminate this painful idea on the worst of evidence, Dr. Ray is not responsible for it. It is not material to the question that Dr. Ray believes in the alleged cannibalism. He does so merely on the substance of information obtained at various times and various sources, which is before us all. At the same time, we will most readily concede that he has all the rights to defend his opinion, which his high reputation as a skillful and intrepid traveler of great experience in the Arctic regions, combined with his manly, conscientious, and modest personal character, can possibly invest him with. Of the propriety of his immediate return to England with the intelligence he had got together, we are fully convinced. As a man of sense and humanity, he perceived that the first and greatest account to which it could be turned was the prevention of the useless hazard of valuable lives, and no one could better know in how much hazard all lives are placed that follow Franklin's track, than he who had made 8 visits to the Arctic shores. With these remarks we can release Dr. Ray from this inquiry, proud of him as an Englishman and happy in his safe return home to well-earned rest. The following is the passage in the report to which we invite attention. Some of the bodies had been buried, probably those of the first victims of famine. Some were in a tent or tents, others under the boat, which had been turned over to form a shelter, and several lay scattered about in different directions. Of those found on the island, one was supposed to have been an officer, as he had a telescope strapped over his shoulders, and his double-barreled gun lay underneath him. From the mutilated state of many of the corpses, and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last resource, cannibalism, as a means of prolonging existence. None of the Eskimo with whom I conversed had seen the whites, nor had they ever been at the place where the bodies were found, but had their information from those who had been there and who had seen the party when traveling. We have stated our belief that the extreme improbability of this inference as to the last resource can be rested, first on close analogy, and secondly on broad general grounds quite apart from the improbabilities and incoherencies of the Eskimo evidence, which is itself given at the very best at second hand. More than this, we presume it to have been given at second hand through an interpreter, and he was in all probability imperfectly acquainted with the language he translated to the white man. We believe that few, if any, Eskimo tribes speak one common dialect, and Franklin's own experience of his interpreters in his former voyage was that they and the Eskimo were encountered understood each other tolerably, an expression which he frequently uses in his book, with the evident intention of showing that their communication was not altogether satisfactory. But even making the very large admission that Dr. Ray's interpreter perfectly understood what he was told, there yet remains the question whether he could render it into language of corresponding weight and value. We recommend any reader who does not perceive the difficulty of doing so and the skill required, even when a copious and elegant European language is in question, to turn to the accounts of the trial of Queen Caroline and to observe the constant discussions that arose, sometimes very important, in reference to the worth in English of words used by the Italian witnesses. There still remains another consideration, and a grave one, which is that 99 interpreters out of 100, whether savage, half-savage, or wholly civilized, interpreting to a person of superior station and attainments, will be under a strong temptation to exaggerate. This temptation will always be strongest precisely where the person interpreted to is seen to be the most excited and impressed by what he hears, for in proportion as he is moved, the interpreter's importance is increased. We have ourselves had an opportunity of inquiring whether any part of this awful information, the unsatisfactory result of various times and various sources, was conveyed by gestures. It was so, and the gesture described us, as often repeated, that of the informant setting his mouth to his own arm, would quite as well describe a man having opened one of his veins and drunk of the stream that flowed from it. If it be inferred that the officer who lay upon his double-barreled gun defended his life to the last against ravenous seamen under the boat or elsewhere, and that he died in so doing, how came his body to be found? That was not eaten, or even mutilated according to the description. Neither were the bodies buried in the frozen earth, disturbed. And is it not likely that if any bodies were resorted to as food, those the most removed from recent life and companionship would have been the first? Was there any fuel in that desolate place for cooking the contents of the kettles? If none, would the little flame of the spirit lamp the travelers may have had with them have sufficed for such a purpose? If not, would the kettles have been defiled for that purpose at all? Some of the corpses, Dr. Ray adds in a letter to the Times, had been sadly mutilated and had been stripped by those who had the misery to survive them, and who were found wrapped in 2 or 3 suits of clothes. Had there been no bears thereabout to mutilate those bodies, no wolves, no foxes, most probably the scurvy, known to be the dreadfulest scourge of Europeans in those latitudes, broke out among the party, virulent as it would inevitably be under such circumstances. It would of itself cause dreadful disfigurement, woeful mutilation, but more than that, it would not only soon annihilate the desire to eat, especially to eat flesh of any kind, but would annihilate the power. Lastly, no man can, with any show of reason, undertake to affirm that this sad remnant of Franklin's gallant band were not set upon and slain by the Eskimo themselves. It is impossible to form an estimate of the character of any race of savages from their deferential behavior to the white man while he is strong. The mistake has been made again and again, and the moment the white man has appeared in the new aspect of being weaker than the savage has changed and sprung upon him. There are pious persons who, in their practice, with a strange inconsistency, claim for every child born to civilization all innate depravity, and for every savage born to the woods and wilds all innate virtue. We believe every savage to be in his heart covetous, treacherous, and cruel, and we have yet to learn what knowledge the white man, lost, houseless, shipless, apparently forgotten by his race, plainly famine-stricken, weak, frozen, helpless, and dying, has of the gentleness of Eskimo nature. Leaving, as we propose, this part of the subject with a glance, let us put a supposititious case. If a little band of British naval officers, educated and trained exactly like the officers of this ill-fated expedition, had, on a former occasion, in command of a party of men vastly inferior to the crews of these two ships, penetrated to the same regions, and been exposed to the rigors of the same climate, if they had undergone such fatigue, exposure, and disaster that scarcely power remained to them to crawl, and they tottered and fell many times in a journey of a few yards, if they could not bear the contemplation of their filth and wretchedness, each other's emaciated figures, ghastly countenances, dilated eyeballs, and spectral voices, if they had eaten their shoes, such outer clothes as they could part with, and not perish of cold, the scraps of acrid marrow yet remaining in the dried and whitened spines of dead wolves, if they had wasted away to skeletons on such fare, and on bits of putrid skin, and bits of hide, and the covers of guns, and pounded bones, if they had passed through all the pangs of famine, had reached that point of starvation where there is little or no pain left, and had descended so far into the valley of the shadow of death that they lay down side by side, calmly and even cheerfully awaiting their release from this world, if they had suffered such dire extremity, and yet lay where the bodies of their dead companions lay unburied, within a few paces of them, and yet never dreamed at the last gasp of resorting to this said last resource, would it not be strong presumptive evidence against an incoherent Eskimo story, collected at various times, as it wandered from various sources? But if the leader of that party were the leader of this very party too, if Franklin himself had undergone those dreadful trials, and had been restored to health and strength, and had been, not for days and months alone, but years, the chief of this very expedition, infusing into it, as such a man necessarily must, the force of his character and discipline, patience and fortitude, would there not be a still greater and stronger moral improbability to set against the wild tales of a herd of savages? Now, this was Franklin's case. He had passed through the ordeal we have described. He was the chief of that expedition, and he was the chief of this. In this he commanded a body of picked English seamen of the first class. In that he and his 3 officers had but one English seaman to rely on, the rest of the men being Canadian voyagers and Indians. His narrative of a journey to the shores of the Polar Sea in 1819-22 is one of the most explicit and enthralling in the whole literature of voyage and travel. The facts are acted and suffered before the reader's eyes in the descriptions of Franklin, Richardson, and Bok, 3 of the greatest names in the history of heroic endurance. See how they gradually sink into the depths of misery. "I was reduced," says Franklin, "long before the worst came, almost to skin and bone, and like the rest of the party suffered from degrees of cold that would have been disregarded whilst in health and vigor. I set out with the intention of going to St. Germain, to hasten his operations, making a canoe, but though he was only 3/4 of a mile distant, I spent 3 hours in a vain attempt to reach him, my strength being unequal to the labor of wading through the deep snow, and I returned quite exhausted, and much shaken by the numerous falls I had got. My associates were all in the same debilitated state. The voyagers were somewhat stronger than ourselves, but more indisposed to exertion on account of their despondency. The sensation of hunger was no longer felt by any of us, yet we were scarcely able to converse upon any other subject than the pleasures of eating. We had a small quantity of this weed, tripe de roche, and always the cause of miserable illness to some of them, in the evening, and the rest of our supper was made up of scraps of roasted leather. The distance walked to-day was 6 miles. Previous to setting out, the whole party ate the remains of their old shoes, and whatever scraps of leather they had, to strengthen their stomachs for the fatigue of the day's journey. Not being able to find any tripe de roche, we drank an infusion of the Labrador tea plant, and ate a few morsels of burnt leather for supper. We were unable to raise the tent, and found its weight too great to carry it on. We therefore cut it up, and took a part of the canvas for a cover. Thus, growing weaker and weaker every day, they reached at last Fort Enterprise, a lonely and desolate hut, where Richardson, then Dr. Richardson, now Sir John, and Hepburn, the English seaman from whom they had been parted, rejoined them. We were all shocked at beholding the emaciated countenances of the doctor and Hepburn, as they strongly evidenced their extremely debilitated state. The alteration in our appearance was equally distressing to them, for since the swellings had subsided, we were little more than skin and bone. The doctor particularly remarked the spectral tone of our voices, which he requested us to make more cheerful, if possible, quite unconscious that his own partook of the same key. In the afternoon Peltier was so much exhausted that he sat up with difficulty and looked piteously. At length he slided from his stool upon the bed, as we supposed to sleep, and in this composed state he remained upwards of 2 hours without our apprehending any danger. We were then alarmed by hearing a rattling in his throat, and on the doctor examining him, he was found to be speechless. He died in the course of the night. Simandre sat up the greater part of the day, and even assisted in pounding some bones, but on witnessing the melancholy state of Peltier, he became very low, and began to complain of cold and stiffness of the joints. Being unable to keep up a sufficient fire to warm him, we laid him down and covered him with several blankets. He did not, however, appear to get better, and I deeply lament to add he also died before daylight. We removed the bodies of the deceased into the opposite part of the house, but our united strength was inadequate to the task of interring them, or even carrying them down to the river. The severe shock occasioned by the sudden dissolution of our two companions rendered us very melancholy. Adam, one of the interpreters, became low and despondent, a change which we lamented the more as we perceived he had been gaining strength and spirits for the 2 preceding days. I was particularly distressed by the thought that the labor of collecting wood must now devolve upon Dr. Richardson and Hepburn, and that my debility would disable me from affording them any material assistance. Indeed, both of them most kindly urged me not to make the attempt. I found it necessary in their absence to remain constantly near Adam, and to converse with him in order to prevent his reflecting on our condition, and to keep up his spirits as far as possible. I also lay by his side at night. The doctor and Hepburn were getting much weaker, and the limbs of the latter were now greatly swelled. They came into the house frequently in the course of the day to rest themselves, and when once seated were unable to rise without the help of one another or of a stick. Adam was for the most part in the same low state as yesterday, but sometimes he surprised us by getting up and walking with an appearance of increased strength. His looks were now wild and ghastly, and his conversation was often incoherent. I may here remark that owing to our loss of flesh, the hardness of the floor, from which we were only protected by a blanket, produced soreness over the body, and especially those parts on which the weight rested in lying. Yet to turn ourselves for relief was a matter of toil and difficulty. However, during this period, and indeed all along after the acute pangs of hunger, which lasted but a short time, had subsided, we generally enjoyed the comfort of a few hours' sleep. The dreams which for the most part, but not always, accompanied it were usually, though not invariably, of a pleasant character, being very often about the enjoyments of feasting. In the daytime we fell into the practice of conversing on common and light subjects, although we sometimes discoursed with seriousness and earnestness on topics connected with religion. We generally avoided speaking directly of our present sufferings, or even of the prospect of relief. I observed that in proportion as our strength decayed, our minds exhibited symptoms of weakness, evidenced by a kind of unreasonable pettishness with each other. Each of us thought the other weaker in intellect than himself, and more in need of advice and assistance. So trifling a circumstance as a change of place, recommended by one as being warmer and more comfortable, and refused by the other from a dread of motion, frequently called forth fretful expressions, which were no sooner uttered than atoned for, to be repeated, perhaps, in the course of a few minutes. The same thing often occurred when we endeavored to assist each other in carrying wood to the fire. None of us were willing to receive assistance, although the task was disproportioned to our strength. On one of these occasions Hepburn was so convinced of this waywardness that he exclaimed, "Dear me, if we are spared to return to England, I wonder if we shall recover our understandings." Surely it must be comforting to the relatives and friends of Franklin and his brave companions in later dangers now at rest, to reflect upon this manly and touching narrative, to consider that at the time it so affectingly describes, and all the weaknesses of which it so truthfully depicts, the bodies of the dead lay within reach, preserved by the cold, but unmutilated, and to know it for an established truth that the sufferers had passed the bitterness of hunger and were then dying passively. They knew the end they were approaching very well, as Franklin's account of the arrival of their deliverance next day shows. Adam had passed a restless night, being disquieted by gloomy apprehensions of approaching death, which we tried in vain to dispel. He was so low in the morning as to be scarcely able to speak. I remained in bed by his side to cheer him as much as possible. The doctor and Hepburn went to cut wood. They had hardly begun their labor when they were amazed at hearing the report of a musket. They could scarcely believe that there was really anyone near until they heard a shout, and immediately espied 3 Indians close to the house. Adam and I heard the latter noise, and I was fearful that a part of the house had fallen upon one of my companions, a disaster which had, in fact, been thought not unlikely. My alarm was only momentary. Dr. Richardson came in to communicate the joyful intelligence that relief had arrived. He and myself immediately addressed thanksgiving to the throne of mercy for this deliverance, but poor Adam was in so low a state that he could scarcely comprehend the information. When the Indians entered, he attempted to rise, but sank down again. But for the seasonable interposition of Providence, his existence must have terminated in a few hours, and that of the rest probably in not many days. But in the preceding trials and privations of that expedition there was one man, Michael, an Iroquois hunter, who did conceive the horrible idea of subsisting on the bodies of the stragglers, if not of even murdering the weakest with the express design of eating them, which is pretty certain. This man planned and executed his wolfish devices at a time when Sir John Richardson and Hepburn were afoot with him every day, when, though their sufferings were very great, they had not fallen into the weakened state of mind we have just read of, and when the mere difference between his bodily robustness and the emaciation of the rest of the party, to say nothing of his mysterious absences and returns, might have engendered suspicion. Yet so far off was the unnatural thought of cannibalism from their minds and from that of Mr. Hood, another officer who accompanied them, though they were all then suffering the pangs of hunger and were sinking every hour, that no suspicion of the truth dawned upon one of them, until the same hunter shot Mr. Hood dead as he sat by a fire. It was after the commission of that crime, when he had become an object of horror and distrust, and seemed to be going savagely mad, that circumstances began to piece themselves together in the minds of the 2 survivors, suggesting a guilt so monstrously unlikely to both of them that it had never flashed upon the thoughts of either until they knew the wretch to be a murderer. To be rid of his presence, and freed from the danger that they at length perceived it to be fraught with, Sir John Richardson, nobly assuming the responsibility he would not allow a man of commoner station to bear, shot this devil through the head, to the infinite joy of all the generations of readers who will honor him in his admirable narrative of that transaction. The words in which Sir John Richardson mentions this Michael, after the earth is rid of him, are extremely important to our purpose, as almost describing the broad general grounds toward which we now approach. His principles, unsupported by a belief in the divine truths of Christianity, were unable to withstand the pressure of severe distress. His countrymen, the Iroquois, are generally Christians, but he was totally uninstructed and ignorant of the duties inculcated by Christianity, and from his long residence in the Indian country seems to have imbibed or retained the rules of conduct which the Southern Indians prescribe to themselves. Heaven forbid that we, sheltered and fed, and considering this question at our own warm hearth, should audaciously set limits to any extremity of desperate distress. It is in reverence for the brave and enterprising, in admiration of the great spirits who can endure even unto the end, in love for their names and in tenderness for their memory, that we think of the specks, once ardent men, scattered about in different directions, on the waste of ice and snow, and plead for their lightest ashes. Our last claim in their behalf and honor against the vague babble of savages is that the instances in which this last resource, so easily received, has been permitted to interpose between life and death are few and exceptional, whereas the instances in which the sufferings of hunger have been borne until the pain was past are very many. Also, and as the citadel of the position, that the better educated the man, the better disciplined the habits, the more reflective and religious the tone of thought, the more gigantically improbable the last resource becomes. Beseeching the reader always to bear in mind that the lost Arctic voyagers were carefully selected for the service, and that each was in his condition no doubt far above the average, we will test the Eskimo kettle stories by some of the most trying and famous cases of hunger and exposure on record. This, however, we must reserve for another and concluding chapter next week. The Lost Arctic Voyagers, Part 1, from Household Words. Recording by Joyce Martin.
The Lost Arctic Voyagers, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 3. The Lost Arctic Voyagers, Part 2, from Household Words. We resume our subject of last week. The account of the sufferings of the shipwrecked men in Don Juan will rise into most minds as our topic presents itself. It is founded, so far as such a writer as Byron may choose to resort to facts in aid of what he knows intuitively, on several real cases. Bligh's undecked boat navigation after the mutiny of the Bounty, and the wrecks of the Centaur, the Peggy, the Pandora, the Juno, and the Thomas, had been, among other similar narratives, attentively read by the poet. In Bligh's case, though the endurances of all on board were extreme, there was no movement towards the last resource, and this, though Bligh in the memorable voyage which showed his knowledge of navigation to be as good as his temper was bad, which is very high praise, could only serve out at the best about an ounce of pork to each person, and was fain to weigh the allowance of bread against a pistol bullet, and in the most urgent need could only administer wine or rum by the teaspoonful. Though the necessities of the party were so great that when a stray bird was caught its blood was poured into the mouths of 3 of the people who were nearest death, and "the body with the entrails, beak, and feet was divided into 18 shares." Though of a captured dolphin there was "issued about 2 ounces, including the offals to each person," and though the time came when, in Bligh's words, "there was a visible alteration for the worse in many of the people, which excited great apprehensions in me, extreme weakness, swelled legs, hollow and ghastly countenances, with an apparent debility of understanding, seemed to me the melancholy presages of approaching dissolution." The Centaur, man of war, sprung a leak at sea in very heavy weather, was perceived after great labour to be fast settling down by the head, and was abandoned by the captain and 11 others in the pinnace. They were in a leaky boat with one of the gunwales stove in nearly the middle of the Western Ocean, without compass, quadrant, or sail, wanting greatcoat or cloak, all very thinly clothed, in a gale of wind and with a great sea running. They had one biscuit divided into 12 morsels for breakfast, and the same for dinner. The neck of a bottle, broke off with the cork in it, served for a glass, and this, filled with water, was the allowance for 24 hours to each man." This misery was endured without any reference whatever to the last resource, for 15 days, at the expiration of which time they happily made land. Observe the captain's words at the height. "Our sufferings were now as great as human strength could bear, but we were convinced that good spirits were a better support than great bodily strength. For on this day Thomas Matthews, quartermaster, perished from hunger and cold. On the day before he had complained of want of strength in his throat, as he expressed it, to swallow his morsel, and in the night grew delirious and died without a groan." What were their reflections? That they could support life on the body. "As it became next to certainty that we should all perish in the same manner in a day or two, it was somewhat comfortable to reflect that dying of hunger was not so dreadful as our imaginations had represented." The Pandora frigate was sent out to Otaheite to bring home for trial such of the mutineers of the Bounty as could be found upon the island. In Endeavour Straits, on her homeward voyage, she struck upon a reef, was got off by great exertion, but had sustained such damage that she soon heeled over and went down. 110 persons escaped in the boats, and entered on a long and dangerous voyage. The daily allowance to each was a musket-ball weight of bread and 2 small wine-glasses of water. "The heat of the sun and reflection of the sand became intolerable, and the quantity of salt water swallowed by the men created the most parching thirst. Excruciating tortures were endured, and one of the men went mad and died." Perhaps this body was devoured. No. "The people at length neglected weighing their slender allowance, their mouths becoming so parched that few attempted to eat, and what was not claimed was returned to the general stock." They were a fine crew, but not so fine as Franklin's, and in a state of high discipline. Only this one death occurred, and all the rest were saved. The Juno, a rotten and unseaworthy ship, sailed from Rangoon for Madras with a cargo of teak wood. She had been out 3 weeks, and had already struck upon a sandbank and sprung a leak, which the crew imperfectly stopped, when she became a wreck in a tremendous storm. The second mate and others, including the captain's wife, climbed into the mizzen-top and made themselves fast to the rigging. The second mate is the narrator of their distresses, and opens them with this remarkable avowal. "We saw that we might remain on the wreck till carried off by famine, the most frightful shape in which death could appear to us. I confess it was my intention, as well as that of the rest, to prolong my existence by the only means that seemed likely to occur, eating the flesh of any whose life might terminate before my own. But this idea we did not communicate or even hint to each other until long afterwards, except once, that the gunner, a Roman Catholic, asked me if I thought there would be a sin in having recourse to such an expedient." Now it might reasonably be supposed with this beginning that the wreck of the Juno furnishes some awful instances of the last resource of the Eskimo stories. Not one. But perhaps no unhappy creature died in this mizzen-top where the second mate was. 6 at least died there, and the body of one Lascar getting entangled in the rigging, so that the survivors in their great weakness could not for some time release it and throw it overboard, which was their manner of disposing of the other bodies, hung there for 2 or 3 days. It is worthy of all attention that as the mate grew weaker, the terrible phantom which had been in his mind at first, as it might present itself to the mind of any other person not actually in the extremity imagined, grew paler and more remote. At first he felt sullen and irritable. On the night of the 4th day he had a refreshing sleep, dreamed of his father, a country clergyman, thought that he was administering the sacrament to him, and drew the cup away when he stretched out his hand to take it. He chewed canvas, lead, any substance he could find, would have eaten his shoes early in his misery, but that he wore none. And yet he says, and at an advanced stage of his story too, quote, "After all that I suffered, I believe it fell short of the idea I had formed of what would probably be the natural consequence of such a situation as that to which we were reduced. I had read or heard that no person could live without food beyond a few days, and when several had elapsed I was astonished at my having existed so long, and concluded that every succeeding day must be the last. I expected, as the agonies of death approached, that we should be tearing the flesh from each other's bones." Later still he adds, quote, "I can give very little account of the rest of the time. The sensation of hunger was lost in that of weakness, and when I could get a supply of fresh water I was comparatively easy." When land was at last descried, he had become too indifferent to raise his head to look at it, and continued lying in a dull and drowsy state, much as Adam the Interpreter lay with Franklin at his side. The Peggy was an American sloop, sailing home from the Azores to New York. She encountered great distress of weather, ran short of provision, and at length had no food on board, and no water, quote, "except about 2 gallons, which remained dirty at the bottom of a cask." The crew ate a cat they had on board, the leather from the pumps, their buttons and their shoes, the candles and the oil. Then they went aft and down into the captain's cabin, and said they wanted him to see lots fairly drawn who should be killed to feed the rest. The captain refusing with horror, they went forward again, contrived to make the lot fall on a negro whom they had on board, shot him, fried a part of him for supper, and pickled the rest, with the exception of the head and fingers, which they threw overboard. The greediest man among them dying raving mad on the 3rd day after this event, they threw his body into the sea. It would seem because they feared to derive a contagion of madness from it if they ate it. 9 days having elapsed in all since the negro's death, and they being without food again, they went below once more and repeated their proposal to the captain, who lay weak and ill in his cot, having been unable to endure the mere thought of touching the negro's remains, that he should see lots fairly drawn. As he had no security but that they would manage, if he still refused, that the lot should fall on him, he consented. It fell on a foremast man, who was the favourite of the whole ship. He was quite willing to die, and chose the man who had shot the negro to be his executioner. While he was yet living, the cook made a fire in the galley, but they resolved, when all was ready for his death, that the fire should be put out again, and that the doomed foremast man should live until an hour before noon next day, after which they went once more into the captain's cabin, and begged him to read prayers, with supplications that a sail might heave in sight before the appointed time. A sail was seen at about 8 o'clock next morning, and they were taken off the wreck. Is there any circumstance in this case to separate it from the others already described, and from the case of the lost Arctic voyagers? Let the reader judge. The ship was laden with wine and brandy. The crew were incessantly drunk from the first hour of their calamities falling upon them. They were not sober, even at the moment when they proposed the drawing of lots. They were with difficulty restrained from making themselves wildly intoxicated while the strange sail bore down to their rescue, and the mate, who should have been the exemplar and preserver of discipline, was so drunk after all that he had no idea whatever of anything that had happened, and was rolled into the boat which saved his life. In the case of the Thomas, the surgeon bled the man to death on whom the lot fell, and his remains were eaten ravenously. The details of this shipwreck are not within our reach, but we confidently assume the crew to have been of an inferior class. The useful and accomplished Sir John Barrow, remarking that it is but too well established, "that men in extreme cases have destroyed each other for the sake of appeasing hunger," instances the English ship the Nautilus and the French ship the Medusa. Let us look into the circumstances of these two shipwrecks. The Nautilus, sloop of war, bound for England with despatches from the Dardanelles, struck one dark and stormy January night on a coral rock in the Mediterranean, and soon broke up. A number of the crew got upon the rock, which scarcely rose above the water, and was less than 400 yards long, and not more than 200 broad. On the 4th day, they having been in the meantime hailed by some of their comrades, who had got into a small whale boat which was hanging over the ship's quarter when she struck, and also knowing that boat to have made for some fishermen not far off, these shipwrecked people ate the body of a young man who had died some hours before, notwithstanding that Sir John Barrow's words would rather imply that they killed some unfortunate person for the purpose. Now, surely, after what we have just seen of the extent of human endurance under similar circumstances, we know this to be an exceptional and uncommon case. It may likewise be argued that few of the people on the rock can have eaten of this fearful food, for the survivors were 50 in number, and were not taken off until the 6th day, and the eating of no other body is mentioned, though many persons died. We come then to the wreck of the Medusa, of which there is a lengthened French account by 2 surviving members of the crew, which was very indifferently translated into English some 35 years ago. She sailed from France for Senegal in company with 3 other vessels, and had about 240 souls on board, including a number of soldiers. She got among shoals and stranded a fortnight after her departure from Aix Roads. After scenes of tremendous confusion and dismay, the people at length took to the boats, and to a raft made of topmast yards and other stout spars strongly lashed together. 150 mortals were crammed together on the raft, of whom only 15 remained to be saved at the end of 13 days. The raft has become the ship, and may always be understood to be meant when the wreck of the Medusa is in question. Upon this raft every conceivable and inconceivable horror possible under the circumstances took place. It was shamefully deserted by the boats, though the land was within 15 leagues at that time, and it was so deep in the water that those who clung to it fore and aft were always immersed in the sea to their middles, and it was only out of the water amidships. It had a pole for a mast on which the topgallant sail of the Medusa was hoisted. It rocked and rolled violently with every wave, so that even in the dense crowd it was impossible to stand without holding on. Within the first few hours people were washed off by dozens, flung themselves into the sea, were stifled in the press, and getting entangled among the spars, rolled lifeless to and fro underfoot. There was a cask of wine upon it, which was secretly broached by the soldiers and sailors, who drank themselves so mad that they resolved to cut the cords asunder, and send the whole living freight to perdition. They were headed by "an Asiatic and soldier in a colonial regiment, of a colossal stature, with short curled hair, an extremely large nose, an enormous mouth, a sallow complexion, and a hideous air." Him an officer cast into the sea, upon which his comrades made a charge at the officer, threw him into the sea, and on his being recovered by their opponents, who launched a barrel to him, tried to cut out his eyes with a penknife. Hereupon an incessant and infernal combat was fought between the two parties, with sabres, knives, bayonets, nails, and teeth, until the rebels were thinned and cowed, and they were all ferociously wild together. On the 3rd day they fell upon the dead bodies with which the raft was covered, and cut off pieces, which some instantly devoured. Many did not touch them. Almost all the officers were of this number." On the 4th, "we dressed some fish," they had fire on the raft, "which we devoured with extreme avidity, but our hunger was so great, and our portion of fish so small, that we added to it some human flesh, which dressing rendered less disgusting. It was this which the officers touched for the first time. From this day we continued to use it, but we could not dress it any more, as we were entirely deprived of the means," through the accidental extinction of their fire, and their having no materials to kindle another. Before the 4th night the raving mutineers rose again, and were cut down and thrown overboard, until only 30 people remained alive upon the raft. On the 7th day there were only 27, and 12 of these, being spent and ill, were every one cast into the sea by the remainder, who then, in an access of repentance, threw the weapons away too, all but one sabre. After that, the soldiers and sailors were eager to devour a butterfly which was seen fluttering on the mast. After that, some of them began to tell the stories of their lives, and thus, with grim joking and raging thirst and reckless bathing among the sharks which had now begun to follow the raft, and general delirium and fever, they were picked up by a ship, to the number and after the term of exposure already mentioned. Are there any circumstances in this frightful case to account for its peculiar horrors? Again the reader shall judge. No discipline worthy of the name had been observed aboard the Medusa from the minute of her weighing anchor. The captain had inexplicably delegated his authority "to a man who did not belong to the staff. He was an ex-officer of the marine, who had just left an English prison where he had been for 10 years." This man held the ship's course against the protest of the officers, who warned him what would come of it. The work of the ship had been so ill done that even the common manoeuvres necessary to the saving of a boy who fell overboard had been bungled, and the boy had been needlessly lost. Important signals had been received from one of the ships in company, and neither answered nor reported to the captain. The Medusa had been on fire through negligence. When she struck, desertion of duty, mean evasion, and fierce recrimination wasted the precious moments. "It is probable that if one of the first officers had set the example, order would have been restored, but every one was left to himself." The most virtuous aspiration of which the soldiers were sensible was to fire upon their officers, and failing that, to tear their eyes out and rend them to pieces. The historians compute that there were not in all upon the raft, before the sick were thrown into the sea, more than 20 men of decency, education, and purpose enough even to oppose the maniacs. To crown all, they described the soldiers as "wretches who were not worthy to wear the French uniform. They were the scum of all countries, the refuse of the prisons where they had been collected to make up the force. When, for the sake of health, they had been made to bathe in the sea, a ceremony from which some of them had the modesty to endeavour to excuse themselves, the whole crew had had ocular demonstration that it was not upon their breasts these heroes wore the insignia of the exploits which had led to their serving the state in the ports of Toulon, Brest, or Rochefort." And is it with the scourged and branded sweepings of the galleys of France, in their debased condition of 38 years ago, that we shall compare the flower of the trained, adventurous spirit of the English navy, raised by Parry, Franklin, Richardson, and Back? Nearly 300 years ago, a celebrated case of famine occurred in the Jacques, a French ship homeward bound from Brazil, with 45 persons on board, of whom 25 were the ship's company. She was a crazy old vessel, fit for nothing but firewood, and had been out 4 months, and was still upon the weary seas far from land, when her whole stock of provisions was exhausted. The very maggots in the dust of the bread-room had been eaten up, and the parrots and monkeys brought from Brazil by the men on board had been killed and eaten, when 2 of the men died. Their bodies were committed to the deep. At least 20 days afterwards, when they had had perpetual cold and stormy weather, and were grown too weak to navigate the ship, when they had eaten pieces of the dried skin of the wild hog, and leather jackets and shoes, and the horn plates of the ship lanterns, and all the wax candles, the gunner died. His body likewise was committed to the deep. They then began to hunt for mice, so that it became a common thing on board to see skeleton men watching eagerly and silently at mouse-holes, like cats. They had no wine and no water, nothing to drink but 1 little glass of cider each per day. When they were come to this pass, 2 more of the sailors died of hunger. Their bodies likewise were committed to the deep. So long and doleful were these experiences on the barren sea, that the people conceived the extraordinary idea that another deluge had happened, and there was no land left. Yet this ship drifted to the coast of Brittany, and no last resource had ever been appealed to. It is worth remarking that after they were saved, the captain declared he had meant to kill somebody privately next day. Whosoever has been placed in circumstances of peril with companions will know the infatuated pleasure some imaginations take in enhancing them and all their remotest possible consequences after they are escaped from, and will know what value to attach to this declaration. In the reign of Queen Elizabeth, a ship's master and 15 men escaped from a wreck in an open boat, which they weighed down very heavy, and were at sea with no fresh water and nothing to eat but the floating seaweed 7 days and nights. "We will all live or die together," said the master on the 3rd day, when one of the men proposed to draw lots, not who should become the last resource, but who should be thrown overboard to lighten the boat. On the 5th day that man and another died. The rest were "very weak and praying for death," but these bodies also were committed to the deep. In the reign of George III, the Wager, man of war, one of a squadron badly found and provided in all respects, sailing from England for South America, was wrecked on the coast of Patagonia. She was commanded by a brutal though bold captain, and manned by a turbulent crew, most of whom were exasperated to a readiness for all mutiny by having been pressed in the Downs in the hour of their arrival at home from long and hard service. When the ship struck, they broke open the officers' chests, dressed themselves in the officers' uniforms, and got drunk in the old Smollett manner. About 150 of them made their way ashore and divided into parties. Great distress was experienced from want of food, and one of the boys, "having picked up the liver of one of the drowned men whose carcass had been dashed to pieces against the rocks, could be with difficulty withheld from making a meal of it." One man in a quarrel on a spot which, in remembrance of their sufferings there, they called Mount Misery, stabbed another mortally, and left him dead on the ground. Though 1/3 of the whole number were no more, chiefly through want, in 8 or 10 weeks, and though they had in the meantime eaten a midshipman's dog, and were now glad to feast on putrid morsels of seal that had been thrown away, certain men came back to this Mount Misery expressly to give this body, which throughout had remained untouched, decent burial, assigning their later misfortunes "to their having neglected this necessary tribute." Afterwards, in an open boat navigation, when rowers died at their oars of want and its attendant weakness, and there was nothing to serve out but bits of rotten seal, the starving crew went ashore to bury the bodies of their dead companions in the sand. At such a condition did even these ill-nurtured, ill-commanded, ill-used men arrive, without appealing to the last resource, that they were so much emaciated, "as hardly to have the shape of men," while the captain's legs "resembled posts, though his body appeared to be nothing but skin and bone," and he had fallen into that feeble state of intellect that he had positively forgotten his own name. In the same reign, an East Indiaman bound from Surah to Mosha and Jeddah in the Dead Sea took fire when 200 leagues distant from the nearest land, which was the coast of Malabar. The mate and 95 other people, white, brown, and black, found themselves in the long-boat, with this voyage before them, and neither water nor provisions on board. The account of the mate who conducted the boat day and night is, "We were never hungry, though our thirst was extreme. On the 7th day our throats and tongues swelled to such a degree that we conveyed our meaning by signs. 16 died on that day, and almost the whole people became silly and began to die laughing. I earnestly petitioned God that I might continue in my senses to my end, which he was pleased to grant, I being the only person on the 8th day that preserved them. 20 more died that day. On the 9th I observed land, which overcame my senses, and I fell into a swoon with thankfulness of joy." Again, no last resource, and can the reader doubt that they would all have died without it? In the same reign, and within a few years of the same date, the Philip Orbin, bark of 80 tons, bound from Barbados to Surinam, broached to at sea and foundered. The captain, the mate, and 2 seamen got clear of the wreck, and into "a small boat 12 or 13 feet long." In accomplishing this escape they all, but particularly the captain, showed great coolness, courage, sense, and resignation. They took the captain's dog on board, and picked up 13 onions which floated out of the ship after she went down. They had no water, no mast, sail, or oars, nothing but the boat, what they wore, and a knife. The boat had sprung a leak, which was stopped with a shirt. They cut pieces of wood from the boat itself, which they made into a mast. They rigged the mast with strips of the shirt, and they hoisted a pair of wide trousers for a sail. The little boat being cut down almost to the water's edge, they made a bulwark against the sea of their own backs. The mate steered with a topmast he had pushed before him to the boat, when he swam to it. On the 3rd day they killed the dog and drank his blood out of a hat. On the 4th day the 2 men gave in, saying they would rather die than toil on, and one persisted in refusing to do his part in bailing the boat, though the captain implored him on his knees. But a very decided threat from the mate to steer him into the other world with the topmast, by bringing it down upon his skull, induced him to turn to again. On the 5th day the mate exhorted the rest to cut a piece out of his thigh and quench their thirst, but no one stirred. He had eaten more of the dog than any of the rest, and would seem from this wild proposal to have been the worse for it, though he was quite steady again next day, and derived relief, as the captain did, from turning a nail in his mouth, and often sprinkling his head with salt water. The captain, first and last, took only a few mouthfuls of the dog, and one of the seamen only tasted it, and the other would not touch it. The onions they all thought of small advantage to them, as engendering greater thirst. On the 8th day the 2 seamen, who had soon relapsed and become delirious and quite oblivious of their situation, died within 3 hours of each other. The captain and mate saw the island of Tobago that evening, but could not make it until late in the ensuing night. The bodies were found in the boat, unmutilated by the last resource. In the same reign still, and within 3 years of this disaster, the American brig Tyrrell sailed from New York for the island of Antigua. She was a miserable tub, grossly unfit for sea, and turned bodily over in a gale of wind 5 days after her departure. 17 people took to a boat 19 feet and a half long and less than 6 feet and a half broad. They had half a peck of white biscuit changed into salt dough by the sea water, and a peck of common ship biscuit. They steered their course by the polar star. Soon after sunset on the 9th day, the second mate and the carpenter died very peacefully. "All betook themselves to prayers, and then, after some little time, stripped the bodies of their 2 unfortunate comrades and threw them overboard." Next night, a man aged 64, who had been 50 years at sea, died, asking to the last for a drop of water. Next day 2 more died in perfect repose. Next night the gunner, 4 more in the succeeding 24 hours. 5 others followed in 1 day. And all these bodies were quietly thrown overboard, though with great difficulty at last, for the survivors were now exceeding weak, and not one had strength to pull an oar. On the 14th or 15th morning, when there were only 3 left alive, and the body of the cabin boy, newly dead, was in the boat, the chief mate "asked his 2 companions whether they thought they could eat any of the boy's flesh. They signified their inclination to try, whence, the body being quite cold, he cut a piece from the inside of its thigh, a little above the knee. Part of this he gave to the captain and boatswain, and reserved a small portion to himself. But on attempting to swallow the flesh it was rejected by the stomachs of all, and the body was therefore thrown overboard." Yet that captain and that boatswain both died of famine in the night, and another whole week elapsed before a schooner picked up the chief mate, left alone in the boat with their unmolested bodies, the dumb evidence of his story. Which bodies the crew of that schooner saw, and buried in the deep. Only 4 years ago, in the autumn of 1850, a party of British missionaries were most indiscreetly sent out by a society to Patagonia. They were 7 in number, and all died near the coast, as nothing but a miracle could have prevented their doing, of starvation. An exploring party under Captain Moorshead of Her Majesty's ship Dido came upon their traces, and found the remains of 4 of them lying by their 2 boats which they had hauled up for shelter. Captain Gardner, their superintendent, who had probably expired the last, had kept a journal until the pencil had dropped from his dying hand. They had buried 3 of their party like Christian men, and the rest had faded away in quiet resignation and without great suffering. They were kind and helpful to one another to the last. One of the common men, just like Adam with Franklin, was "cast down at the loss of his comrades, and wandering in his mind," before he passed away. Against this strong case in support of our general position, we will faithfully set 4 opposite instances we have sought out. The first is the case of the New Horn, Dutch vessel, which was burnt at sea and blew up with a great explosion upwards of 200 years ago. 72 people escaped in 2 boats. The old Dutch captain's narrative being rather obscure, and, as we believe, scarcely traceable beyond a French translation, it is not easy to understand how long they were at sea before the people fell into the state to which the ensuing description applies. According to our calculation, however, they had not been shipwrecked many days. We take the period to have been less than a week, and they had 7 or 8 pounds of biscuit on board. "Our misery daily increased, and the rage of hunger urging us to extremities, the people began to regard each other with ferocious looks. Consulting among themselves, they secretly determined to devour the boys on board, and after their bodies were consumed, to throw lots who should next suffer death, that the lives of the rest might be preserved." The captain dissuading them from this with the utmost loathing and horror, they reconsidered the matter, and decided "that should we not get sight of land in 3 days, the boys should be sacrificed." On the last of the 3 days the land was made, so whether any of them would have executed this intention can never be known. The second case runs thus. In the last year of the last century, 6 men were induced to desert from the English artillery at St. Helena. A deserter from any honest service is not a character from which to expect much, and to go on board an American ship, the only vessel then lying in those roads. After they got on board in the dark, they saw lights moving about on shore, and fearful that they would be missed and taken, went over the side with the connivance of the ship's people, got into the whaleboat, and made off, purposing to be taken up again by and by when the ship was under way. But they missed her, and rowed and sailed about for 16 days, at the end of which their provisions were all consumed. After chewing bamboo and gnawing leather and eating a dolphin, one of them proposed, when 10 days more had run out, that lots should be drawn which deserter should bleed himself to death to support life in the rest. It was agreed to and done. They could take very little of this food. The third is the case of the Nottingham galley, trading from Great Britain to America, which was wrecked on a rock called Boone Island off the coast of Massachusetts. About 2 days afterwards, the narrative is not very clear in its details, the cook died on the rock. Therefore, writes the captain, we laid him in a convenient place for the sea to carry him away. None then proposed to eat his body, though several afterwards acknowledged that they, as well as myself, had thoughts of it." They were "tolerably well supplied with fresh water throughout." But when they had been upon the rock about a fortnight, and had eaten all their provisions, the carpenter died. And then the captain writes, "We suffered the body to remain with us till morning, when I desired those who were best able to remove it. I crept out myself to see whether Providence had yet sent us anything to satisfy our craving appetites. Returning before noon, and observing that the dead body still remained, I asked the men why they had not removed it, to which they answered that all were not able. I therefore fastened a rope to it, and giving the utmost of my assistance, we, with some difficulty, got it out of the tent. But the fatigue and consideration of our misery together so overcame my spirits, that being ready to faint, I crept into the tent, and was no sooner there than, as the highest aggravation of distress, the men began requesting me to give them the body of their lifeless comrade to eat, the better to support their own existence." The captain ultimately complied. They became brutalized and ferocious, but they suffered him to keep the remains on a high part of the rock, and they were not consumed when relief arrived. The fourth and last case is the wreck of the St. Lawrence, bound from Quebec for New York. An ensign of foot, bringing home dispatches, relates how he went ashore on a desolate part of the coast of North America, and how those who were saved from the wreck suffered great hardships, both by land and sea, and were thinned in their numbers by death, and buried their dead. All this time they had some provisions, though they ran short, but at length they were reduced to live upon weeds and tallow and melted snow. The tallow being all gone, they lived on weed and snow for 3 days, and then the ensign came to this: "The time was now arrived when I thought it highly expedient to put the plan before mentioned, casting lots who should be killed, into execution. But on feeling the pulse of my companions, I found some of them rather averse to the proposal. The desire of life still prevailed above every other sentiment, notwithstanding the wretchedness of our condition, and the impossibility of preserving it by any other method. I thought it an extraordinary instance of infatuation that men should prefer the certainty of a lingering and miserable death to the distant chance of escaping one more immediate and less painful. However, on consulting with the mate what was to be done, I found that although they objected to the proposal of casting lots for the victim, yet all concurred in the necessity of some one being sacrificed for the preservation of the rest. The only question was how it should be determined, when by a kind of reasoning more agreeable to the dictates of self-love than justice, it was agreed that as the captain was now so exceedingly reduced as to be evidently the first who would sink under our present complicated misery, as he had been the person to whom we considered ourselves in some measure indebted for all our misfortunes, and further, as he had ever since our shipwreck been the most remiss in his exertions towards the general good, he was undoubtedly the person who should be the first sacrificed." The design of which the ensign writes with this remarkable coolness was not carried into execution, by reason of their falling in with some Indians, but some of the party who were afterwards separated from the rest declared when they rejoined them that they had eaten of the remains of their deceased companions. Of this case it is to be noticed that the captain is alleged to have been a mere kidnapper, sailing under false pretences, and therefore not likely to have had by any means a choice crew; that the greater part of them got drunk when the ship was in danger, and that they had not a very sensitive associate in the ensign, on his own highly disagreeable showing. It appears to us that the influence of great privation upon the lower and least disciplined class of character is much more bewildering and maddening at sea than on shore. The confined space, the monotonous aspect of the waves, the mournful winds, the monotonous motion, the dead uniformity of colour, the abundance of water that cannot be drunk to quench the raging thirst, which the ancient mariner perceived to be one of his torments, these seemed to engender a diseased mind with greater quickness and of a worse sort. The conviction on the part of the sufferers that they hear voices calling for them, that they descry ships coming to their aid, that they hear the firing of guns and see the flash, that they can plunge into the waves without injury to fetch something or to meet somebody, is not often paralleled among suffering travellers by land. The mirage excepted, a delusion of the desert, which has its counterpart upon the sea, not included under these heads, we remember nothing of this sort experienced by Bruce, for instance, or by Mungo Park, least of all by Franklin in the memorable book we have quoted. Our comparison of the records of the two kinds of trial leads us to believe that even men who might be in danger of the last resource at sea would be very likely to pine away by degrees and never come to it ashore. In his published account of the ascent of Mont Blanc, which is an excellent little book, Mr. Albert Smith describes with very humorous fidelity that when he was urged on by the guides, in a very drowsy state when he would have given the world to lie down and go to sleep for ever, he was conscious of being greatly distressed by some difficult and altogether imaginary negotiations respecting a non-existent bedstead. Also by an impression that a familiar friend in London came up with the preposterous intelligence that the King of Prussia objected to the party's advancing because it was his ground. But these harmless vagaries are not the present question, being commonly experienced under most circumstances where an effort to fix the attention or exert the body contends with a strong disposition to sleep. We have been their sport thousands of times, and have passed through a series of most inconsistent and absurd adventures while trying hard to follow a short, dull story related by some eminent conversationalist after dinner. No statement of cannibalism, whether on the deep or the dry land, is to be admitted supposititiously or inferentially, or on any but the most direct and positive evidence. No, not even as occurring among savage people, against whom it was in earlier times too often a pretence for cruelty and plunder. Mr. Prescott, in his brilliant history of the conquest of Mexico, observes of a fact so astonishing as the existence of cannibalism among a people who had attained considerable advancement in the arts and graces of life, that, quote, "they did not feed on human flesh merely to gratify a brutish appetite, but in obedience to their religion, a distinction," he justly says, "worthy of notice." End quote. Besides which, it is to be remarked that many of these feeding practices rest on the authority of narrators who distinctly saw St. James and the Virgin Mary fighting at the head of the troops of Cortes, and who possessed, therefore, to say the least, an unusual range of vision. It is curious to consider, with our general impressions on the subject, very often derived, we have no doubt, from Robinson Crusoe, if the oaks of men's beliefs could be traced back to acorns, how rarely the practice even among savages has been proved. The word of a savage is not to be taken for it, firstly, because he is a liar; secondly, because he is a boaster; thirdly, because he often talks figuratively; fourthly, because he is given to a superstitious notion that when he tells you he has his enemy in his stomach, you will logically give him credit for having his enemy's valour in his heart. Even the sight of cooked and dissevered human bodies among this or that tattooed tribe is not proof. Such appropriate offerings to their barbarous, wide-mouthed, goggle-eyed gods savages have been often seen and known to make. And although it may usually be held as a rule that the fraternity of priests lay eager hands upon everything meant for the gods, it is always possible that these offerings are an exception, as at once investing the idols with an awful character, and the priests with a touch of disinterestedness, whereof their order may occasionally stand in need. The imaginative people of the East, in the palmy days of its romance, not very much accustomed to the sea, perhaps, but certainly familiar by experience and tradition with the perils of the desert, had no notion of the last resource among civilized human creatures. In the whole wild circle of the Arabian Nights it is reserved for ghouls, gigantic blacks with one eye, monsters like towers of enormous bulk and dreadful aspect, and unclean animals lurking on the seashore that puffed and blew their way into caves where the dead were interred. Even for Sinbad the Sailor, buried alive, the story-teller found it easier to provide some natural sustenance in the shape of so many loaves of bread and so much water let down into the pit with each of the other people buried alive after him, whom he killed with a bone, for he was not nice, than to invent this dismal expedient. We are brought back to the position almost embodied in the words of Sir John Richardson towards the close of the former chapter. In weighing the probabilities and improbabilities of the last resource, the foremost question is, not the nature of the extremity, but the nature of the men. We submit that the memory of the lost Arctic voyagers is placed, by reason and experience, high above the taint of this so easily allowed connection, and that the noble conduct and example of such men, and of their own great leader himself, under similar endurances, belies it, and outweighs by the weight of the whole universe the chatter of a gross handful of uncivilized people with a domesticity of blood and blubber. Utilitarianism will protest, "They are dead, why care about this?" Our reply shall be, because they are dead, therefore we care about this. Because they served their country well, and deserved well of her, and can ask no more on this earth for her justice or her loving kindness, give them both full measure, pressed down, running over. Because no Franklin can come back to write the honest story of their woes and resignation, read it tenderly and truly in the book he has left us. Because they lie scattered on those wastes of snow, and are as defenceless against the remembrance of coming generations as against the elements into which they are resolving, and the winter winds that alone can waft them home, now impalpable air. Therefore cherish them gently, even in the breasts of children. Therefore teach no one to shudder without reason at the history of their end. Therefore confide with their own firmness in their fortitude, their lofty sense of duty, their courage, and their religion. End of The Lost Arctic Voyagers, Part 2.
Mr. Bookman here. I hope you enjoyed today's audiobook. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and go ahead and tell us what you thought about the book in the comments. But more importantly, don't forget to check out the description. It's got a link in there that's going to give you access to over 200 ebooks. And we'll see you next time. And remember, you are appreciated.